You have seen the results. You spit in the tube, you sent it off, and you waited for the confirmation of what you have been told your entire life. Your family is English through and through. Maybe there is a bit of Scottish or Welsh mixed in, but your roots are planted firmly in Yorkshire or London or the West Country. Your family tree goes back generations in the same sleepy British towns. And then the email arrives. You open your DNA results, and there it is staring back at you. 15%, 25%, perhaps even 40% Irish. At first, you think it is a mistake. You ask your parents, you ask your grandparents, and they proudly tell you that there is absolutely no Irish blood in the family. They say the test must be flawed. The algorithms got confused. For a long time, many people just accept that explanation and move on. Then, they start looking closely at the paper trail. They start noticing gaps. They begin talking to genealogists, digging into Victorian census returns, untangling the messy, often heartbreaking reality of 19th century Britain. And what they find is that the DNA test was not lying. The truth had just been buried. The label British on a modern census or a family tree often conceals a much more complicated, devastating story of survival. The ancestors who carried this hidden Irish DNA were not lying to their descendants either. They were deliberately erasing their past out of absolute necessity, hiding from prejudice, extreme poverty, and the threat of deportation. They were passing down a cleaned-up, fabricated identity to protect the generations that followed. So how can you tell if your seemingly thoroughly British family actually has hidden Irish roots? I have put together 7 telling signs that point to suppressed Irish ancestry. None of these is proof on its own, but when several begin appearing together, they often reveal a hidden chapter of family history that has been buried for generations. If you are ready to uncover the truth about your family's history and break through these historical brick walls, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel right now. We explore deep genealogical mysteries like this all the time, and subscribing is the best way to support this work and ensure you don't miss the next vital breakthrough. Let us get into it. Sign 1. Your ancestors clustered in major industrial cities or specific port towns during the 1800s. Geography is always your first big clue. The mid-19th century saw one of the largest mass migrations in modern history due to the Great Famine in Ireland. Between 1845 and 1852, over 1 million Irish people fled starvation and disease, crossing the Irish Sea on coffin ships. But they did not just scatter randomly across the British countryside. They went precisely to the filthy, overcrowded slums where the cheapest, hardest labor was desperately needed. If your family has deep roots in Victorian Liverpool, Manchester, Glasgow, London, Birmingham, or the industrial towns of Lancashire, your chances of hidden Irish ancestry skyrocket. I'm not talking about a grandfather moving to London in the 1920s. I'm talking about ancestors who suddenly appear out of thin air in the docklands of Liverpool around 1847. I recently spoke with a woman from a proud Mancunian family. Her whole life, she was told her ancestors were wealthy Lancashire cotton merchants. When she finally found the 1851 census, the truth shattered that myth in an incredible way. Her great-great-grandmother wasn't a merchant. She was a 10-year-old orphan living in a disease-ridden cellar in Manchester with 12 other starving children. She had arrived on a boat from County Cork 3 weeks before. Her parents died on the voyage over. To survive, this 10-year-old girl was taken in by an English factory overlooker, given an English name, and told to never speak of Ireland again. She took that secret to her grave. A family with a proud local identity today, whose ancestors were living in those cities in the 1850s, very often sits on top of a tragic, hidden Irish foundation. The city itself is the fingerprint left behind by that migration. Sign 2, the names in your family tree undergo sudden, seemingly impossible transformations. When Irish immigrants arrived in Britain, their names instantly marked them as targets for discrimination. The phrase, "no Irish need apply," was an unwritten rule, and frequently a written one, for jobs and housing. To get a job, to rent a room, or simply survive the intense hostility of the era, an Irish name had to vanish. While some stories of survival are incredibly dramatic, most are defined by a desperate desire to simply become ordinary. The most common method of hiding was dropping prefixes. An O'Connor became Connor. A McGowan became Gowan. Many Irish families literally translated their Gaelic surnames into English, and the surname McGabhan translates to son of the blacksmith, so they adopted the surname Smith. The surname O'Murchada was anglicized to Murphy, but sometimes they just took on completely unrelated, mundane English names just to blend in. I worked with a client tracing an ancestor named Thomas Clark. According to the family, Thomas was the most perfectly boring, unremarkable man in history. He worked as a quiet village baker in Yorkshire for 40 years, never missed a day of work, kept his head down, and spoke with a mild local accent. When we dug past his marriage certificate, however, Thomas Clark ceased to exist. We eventually matched him to a famine ship arrival. His real name was Thomas O'Clery. He wasn't boring, he was exhausted. He had survived starvation in Ireland, crossed the sea, translated his name to Clark, and constructed a meticulously average English life. The twist wasn't a dark, shocking scandal. It was the quiet, invisible heroism of a man who erased his entire culture just so his kids could have a normal, quiet life in a Yorkshire village. Sign 3, there are glaring shifts and inconsistencies in census records regarding birthplaces. This requires looking at multiple decennial census returns for the exact same person, and it often reveals terrifying moments of sheer panic. In the UK, the census began recording specific birthplaces in 1851. What you're looking for is a person moving across time. Suppose you find a direct ancestor living in London in the 1851 census. In the column for his birthplace, it simply says Ireland. But 10 years later, in the 1861 census, his birthplace is inexplicably listed as London. By 1871, it might say Middlesex. Did he forget where he was born? Absolutely not. He was hiding from the state. Under the brutal poor laws of the 19th century, destitute individuals born in Ireland could be forcibly repatriated. Local parishes in England did not want to pay for poor relief, so magistrates would round up impoverished Irish workers, load them onto ships, and dump them back in Ireland, a country they had fled to escape death. I uncovered a record for a pregnant woman in 1860s Yorkshire who had originally listed her birthplace as Galway. But when you look closely at the original physical census sheet, you can see that she fiercely scribbled over Galway with thick black ink and wrote Leeds over the top of it. Historical context revealed that repatriation officers were literally going door to door on her street that exact week. She altered a government document in a moment of sheer terror to prevent her unborn child from being deported to a workhouse in Ireland. By the time her children were grown, the official paper trail declared the entire family strictly English. The crossing out of that single word was the exact moment her family chose survival over their heritage. Sign 4. Your working class ancestors are concentrated in heavily specific, dangerous occupations. In Victorian Britain, the Irish were forced into the absolute bottom tier of the labor market. If you look at an 1851 or 1861 census and see a cluster of ancestors working as navvies, the men who dug the canals and railways by hand, dock laborers, coal heavers, or hawkers, you must pay attention. These occupations indicated a marginalized social status inhabited almost exclusively by the newly arrived Irish. But over the generations, families tended to polish these truths. I worked on a case where a family proudly believed their ancestor was a distinguished civil engineer who helped architect the Great British Railways. Their family lore painted him in a top hat, standing over blueprints. The reality we found in the records was jarring, but ultimately far more honorable. The official documents proved he wasn't an engineer at all. He was an illiterate Irish navvy. He didn't wear a top hat. He stood in freezing mud for 12 hours a day, using a pickaxe to break solid rock. He lived in a temporary rat-infested boarding house in Glasgow with 10 other Irish-born men who clustered together for safety. The family had completely romanticized his life to mask the brutal poverty he endured, but realizing the truth, that a man with nothing worked himself literally to the bone so his grandchildren could eventually go to school and call themselves middle class, is a far more profound legacy than a fake top hat. Before we dive into the final 3 signs, including a massive twist on how you are probably misreading your DNA test, let me remind you that if these historical puzzles are resonating with you, please subscribe to the channel right now. Your support allows me to keep making these deep dive videos, and hitting that subscribe button ensures we can continue untangling the complex realities of our shared past together. Now, let's look at the actual genetics. Sign 5, your DNA test actually reconnects a severed family line, even when the broad ethnic labels confuse you. This is where commercial genetics throw the biggest curveballs. You might get a result that says 30% Scottish, 10% Irish, and the rest English. You proudly assume the Scottish comes from some fierce Highland warrior ancestor you've built in your imagination. But here's the thing. The algorithms of companies like Ancestry DNA desperately struggle to separate Scottish DNA from Northern Irish DNA. If it doesn't have a perfectly pure reference panel, it throws those segments into neighboring regions. The real secret isn't in the broad ethnicity estimates, it's in your DNA matches. I recently worked with a British man who couldn't figure out why he shared significant DNA with a tightly knit group of people living in an incredibly remote village in County Mayo, Ireland. He had no documented Irish ancestors. But when he finally sent a message to one of these genetic cousins in Mayo, he received a message back that provided one of the most stunning reveals I've ever seen. The family in Ireland wrote back, "Are you descended from Michael? Because we have a letter from 1849. During the worst of the famine, Michael had walked to a port, boarded a boat for England, and vanished. For 170 years, the family in Ireland never knew if he survived the crossing, if he starved in a Liverpool slum, or if he started a family. The British descendant, sitting at his computer in modern-day London, was the living, breathing proof that Michael had survived. The British man's surname had been anglicized, his history wiped clean, but his DNA had literally solved a 170-year-old missing persons case. When you look at your DNA, look closely at your matches in Ireland. They might be holding a puzzle piece their family has been waiting a century to place. Sign 6, an abrupt shift in religious records, particularly involving Catholic traditions secretly hidden in a staunchly Protestant family. This is one of the most reliable paper trail indicators you can find, and it often leads to the most emotional revelations. In the 19th century, the vast majority of the Irish fleeing the famine were Roman Catholic. Britain, conversely, was overwhelmingly and institutionally Protestant. Catholicism was viewed with intense suspicion and hostility. When Irish families arrived, many quietly let their faith go to blend in. They began marrying in the local Anglican church simply because it was easier and less stigmatized. But the transition was rarely clean, and the secret often leaked out in agonizing ways. A family recently contacted me claiming a long, proud lineage of strict, anti-Catholic English Protestants. There was immense prejudice in their family against the Irish, but while cleaning out their recently deceased grandmother's attic, they found her grandmother's Victorian wedding dress. Sewn deep inside the lining of the hem, completely invisible from the outside, were tiny Catholic rosary beads. It sparked a massive investigation. We bypassed the standard government records and went straight to the Catholic parish registers in the poorest parts of 19th century London. And there it was. The grandmother who wore that dress was secretly baptized in a makeshift Catholic chapel in a pub basement. Her parents were from Galway. She had married into a wealthy English Protestant family, and to survive the marriage, she renounced her true identity completely. She sat in an Anglican church every Sunday of her life, holding a secret rosary in the hem of her dress, terrified her own husband would find out she was Irish. Finding a Catholic baptism hidden in an otherwise unbroken line of Protestants is a massive emotional red flag pointing toward an Irish origin. Sign 7, your family has oral traditions of profound silence, inexplicable trauma, or missing maiden names. Unlike families who proudly pass down myths of royalty or famous historical connections, families surviving severe trauma often pass down absolutely nothing. The famine was a catastrophic event. People who survived it and arrived in Britain had witnessed horrors they refused to speak of. When these survivors established new lives, they built impenetrable walls around their past. If you ask older relatives about a specific great-grandparent, and the answer is always, she said her parents died in a fire, or she told us she was a foundling, you are often looking at a trauma cover-up. One of the most heartbreaking, I can't believe this happened moments I ever witnessed involved a family who was told their great-grandmother had lost her entire family in a tragic London house fire in 1850. The story was passed down for 4 generations. The descendants even visited a random grave in London every year to lay flowers. But the genealogy proved no such fire ever occurred. The devastating truth was that her family hadn't burned in a fire. They had all been placed in a brutal workhouse in County Clare, Ireland in 1847. The state deemed the youngest daughter the only one healthy enough to work, put her on a boat to England alone, and she never saw her parents or 6 siblings again. They all perished in the workhouse. To cope with the unimaginable survivor's guilt, she invented the house fire story when she had her own children. The silence, the missing maiden names, the fabricated tragedies, these are precisely what makes it a story. The fact that the paper trail is blank is exactly what proves they were running from something. So, if you look at your family tree and see more than one of these signs, a sudden appearance in a disease-ridden Liverpool slum in 1851, an English name that transitions from a secret Catholic baptism to a Protestant marriage, an ordinary occupation as a laborer alongside other Irishmen, and a DNA test stubbornly matching you to a remote townland in Mayo, here is exactly what you do next. You must leave the straightforward English civil records behind and start looking at the margins. You need to order the original, uncensored birth and marriage certificates from the General Register Office. You need to carefully read the names of the witnesses on the marriage certificates, because very often a person married under a fake English name, but their witness was an Irish relative who didn't bother to hide. Next, dive deeply into the Catholic Heritage Registers online, hosted on sites like Find My Past. Do not assume your ancestors were Protestant just because your living relatives are. Look up the Catholic parishes near the docks where your family lived. You are searching for the ultimate holy grail in Irish genealogy, a priest who bothered to write the exact Irish home parish of the parents in the baptismal margin. Finding that one scribbled word, Kerry, Mayo, Clare, is the difference between an endless mystery and a heavily documented historical fact. These 7 signs are deeply personal, desperate historical directions. They point toward agonizing choices an ancestor made to endure unimaginable prejudice and build a life in a hostile country. Somewhere in your family tree, someone crossed the Irish Sea carrying nothing but a name they would later abandon. They systematically erased themselves so that you could thrive in peace. Your hidden DNA is the only thing they could not scrub away. It is the ultimate, indestructible memory of exactly who they were. Thank you so much for watching. If this video helped you connect the dots in your own family tree, please ensure you subscribe to the channel right now to catch all of our future deep dives into historical DNA and family mysteries. I want to hear from you down in the comments. Drop your family story below. Tell me which of these 7 signs hits closest to home. Have you uncovered a fake name? Did your ancestors suddenly appear in a London slum? Did your DNA test throw a massive twist at you? Your story might just be the exact missing clue someone else reading the comments needs to break through their own brick wall. Thank you again, and keep searching.